This summer, we've been using the theme of taking a road trip to guide us through our times of worship. It's been shaped by the readings we've been doing through the Gospel of Luke. We're beginning in chapter 9 of Luke. Jesus sets his face towards Jerusalem and then engages in a series of teachings along the way with those who are his first immediate followers and the growing group of persons who are following and seeking to learn the way of love. It seems to me that it is a fair framework to say we're hearing his teachings on how best to love God and to love our neighbor. We've heard some teachings that tell us about doing and some teachings that tell us about being, about how we are to relate, but about who we are to be in relationship to God as well. Today's teaching is prompted by a question from the crowd. Tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me. Well, Jesus probably very wisely stays out of the family dispute. But instead, he takes advantage of that opportunity to give teachings on possessions and what they mean in our life of discipleship. What he helps us know is that what we have or what we don't have is always considered within that larger story of how we love God and love our neighbor. That how we use our possessions determines how we grow in our richness toward God. It seems to me we might hear the contrast of what he's offering to us as the starting point in our reflections. One way of asking the question, and I think this is the way of faith, is to say, how will my love of God and my love of my neighbor determine how I use my possessions? So often, we're tempted to turn it around and to say, how will my possessions determine how I love God and my neighbor? But Jesus asks us to start first with how we will love God, how we will love our neighbor, and let that then shape our priorities. You see, the call of discipleship is a call that tugs on our hearts and invites us to stick our toes in the water, to give it a try, to follow Jesus and to say, what does that mean for my life? What does that mean for my decisions and for my choices? And so what we're hearing here is a call to us to be responsive to how God is leading, how our hearts are being shaped, so that we cultivate that desire to share, that desire to show compassion, to engage with the other, and to move beyond isolation to meaningful relationship. So as I was reflecting on that, I found myself thinking about what are some stories that we've heard, experiences of others that we might learn from. And I thought of three that I want to help us recall. The first is the life of Osceola McCarty. You may not recognize her name, but you may recognize her story. Came out several years ago. Turns out she was an elderly woman in Mississippi who had spent her life washing clothes for others. It was the same work that her mother had done. It was work she had learned as a child and continued throughout her life. She was orphaned very early on. Both her mother's death and an aunt's death occurred prematurely, and it left her to sort of fend for herself. So her education ended with the 6th grade. But her mother had taught her from the very beginning to be one who used her money wisely and to save wisely, to spend carefully, to be thrifty, to be frugal in the way she used her resources. As Osceola grew up, she would put money aside in the bank. And eventually there came this moment where the bank contacted her and said, we need to have some conversation because your assets have grown in a way. We want to help you think through what you want to do with that. So Osceola took a bag of dimes, and they used that bag of dimes to help parcel out and represent how she wanted to share her gifts upon her death. 10% would go to her church. 10% she designated for each of 3 relatives that she felt like needed special care. The remaining 60% she designated for the University of Southern Mississippi to be used for scholarships for those who might not be able to afford to go to school otherwise. Her gift, saved across her life, saved across her years of working as one who washed clothes for others. Her gift was $150,000. Money that she had cared for so that she could make a gift to assist others. Another story comes from a Johnson City native. You may know that Detroit Tigers pitcher Daniel Norris grew up in Johnson City, and that one of the things he is most known for, not only for being a great pitcher, but is known for how he lives during the off season. He has chosen to take his residence as a 1978 VW van that he affectionately calls Shaggy. And if you look him up on YouTube, you will find Daniel Norris and Shaggy on all of their adventures. He shows you the front portion, which is his kitchen, and the back portion, which he says are the back 2 rooms. It's a VW van, but he refers to them as his 2 rooms, of his closet and his bedroom. He says it takes about $25 to fill the whole thing up, but he's decided instead that he does better if he just puts in about $7 or $8 at a time, because he gets a little carried away if it's a full tank of gas and is prone to wander. So he thinks he does better to do just a little at a time. He received a $2 million signing bonus when he moved to the major leagues, but he's chosen to live on $800 per month. What he has invested in is a camera. And so he has committed himself to taking pictures that he thinks best show the wonders of God's creation that he is seeing as he travels around the country, but also to take pictures of those he's meeting, those who he's engaging in conversation, and whose stories he wants the world to know. I saw an interview of Daniel Norris, and the person interviewing him said, "This is pretty radical. And people don't always think of Christians as being very radical." He said, "Do you think Christians should live a radical life?" And he said something like this: "Of course we should live radically." He said, "We should love radically, and we should give radically." And so he's making choices that help him to live simply and to live with a generous heart. And then, of course, there's John Wesley. John Wesley, who's our ancestor in faith in the Wesleyan tradition, who used as his personal guiding principle and as the principle that he taught others in the Methodist movement to earn all you can, save all you can, and give all you can. He too made a determination of how much he would live on. He chose an amount of 30 pounds per year, what was determined at that time to be a reasonable figure for a single man to live on. And that's what he chose as his income for the rest of his life. Now, he earned more than that, earned as much as 1,400 pounds in a year, but lived on the 30 and gave the rest away. That lesson and commitment came out of an experience he had while he was teaching at Oxford. He had bought some pictures for his room, and as he came back to his room, he passed a young maid who was not dressed very warmly, and it was wintertime, and he realized that she needed a coat. So he reached into his pocket to offer her money. And because he had spent his money on these pictures to decorate his room, he realized he didn't have enough money to buy her a coat. It was a convicting experience for him. He decided it mattered more to him to be able to share with others. And so he chose intentionally what he would use for himself, and then how he would continue to work hard to earn, to save, so that he could also give. Well, when I thought of those stories, those were just some that had come to mind for me that I had heard. I bet you know persons who've made those kinds of intentional decisions, and you may have done so yourself. But they seem to me to be critical examples of persons who've understood that the life of faith starts us with how do we love God, how do we love the other, and that then shapes how we make our other decisions. There's a little saying, bumper sticker, that you've probably seen that says, "This life isn't a dress rehearsal." This life isn't a dress rehearsal. We only get to go through it once. So the decisions we make are the opportunities that we have to bear witness to God's love to another. Our scriptures have Jesus telling a story where the response to the man who chose just to hold on to his possessions, to build a bigger barn, is to hear these words, "You fool, you fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" You see, we can spend our time building bigger barns and storing up for ourselves, and we will die. And our stuff will pass on, for good or for ill. Or we can spend our time finding ways to share, finding ways to invest in others, finding ways to advance the causes of Christ and his kingdom, and we will die. But the legacy of love and generosity will continue on. That's why the church never apologizes for opportunities for us to give. Part of our life together is shaping our hearts, shaping our minds, shaping who we are, so that all of our decisions start from loving God and loving our neighbor. If we're holding on so tight to our possessions, we might just miss the gifts that make us rich toward God. As I've reflected on this passage for today, I found myself thinking that there are times that we hear these words as a cautionary tale, as a warning, maybe even a scolding. But I would like to invite us to hear him as words that lead us to freedom, that are truly an invitation to life. And I've thought and prayed about what that meant. And there were some words that came to me that I offer to you this morning as a reflection, maybe as a prayer, that I want to share with you as we close. So often we hear the call to give, the call to let go, as a prying of our hands, a breaking open of what we've held on to for our security. But it seems to me that what we're being asked to do is to break open our hearts so that we might more fully know ourselves, might more fully know the love of God, might more fully know our fears. And that as we know all of that more completely, as our hands are opened, our hearts are opened, our lives are opened, that we might more fully experience the riches that God seeks to offer us. The riches of God's presence with us, of God's transforming grace, of God's love for us. In a few moments, we'll be sharing around the table. And part of our words invite us to hear the words of Jesus, to take into ourselves the one whose life was broken open, that we might know life in its abundance. This day, I hope we hear that call to generosity, not as a prying away that takes something from us, but an opening up that gives us the fullness, the richness of God's grace. Amen.